Judge Emma Richardson sat behind her wooden bench on a cold Tuesday morning in November. The old courthouse felt heavy with the weight of another busy day. She had been hearing cases since 8 o'clock, and it was now nearly noon. Her back ached from sitting in the same position for hours, and her stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had skipped breakfast again. The courtroom was packed with people waiting for their turn. Some sat nervously on the hard wooden benches, while others checked their phones or whispered to family members beside them. Traffic violations, minor disputes, and parking tickets filled her schedule every Tuesday. It was the same routine week after week, month after month. Emma rubbed her temples and looked at the stack of files on her desk. Each folder represented someone's mistake, someone's problem that had landed them in her courtroom. After 15 years as a judge, she had heard every excuse, every sob story, every plea from mercy. Today felt no different from any other day. "Next case," she called out, barely looking up from her papers. Her voice echoed through the quiet courtroom. A well-dressed black woman named Rebecca Thompson stepped forward from the third row of benches. She wore a simple blue dress that looked professional but not expensive. Her shoes were polished, and her hair was neatly styled. Rebecca carried herself with quiet dignity, walking steadily toward the defendant's table despite the nervous energy that filled the room. Rebecca had been given a speeding ticket 3 weeks ago on Maple Street, just 6 blocks from the courthouse. She had been driving 12 miles over the speed limit when Officer Martinez pulled her over. The ticket sat in her purse for 2 weeks before she finally decided to contest it in court. "Your Honor, I was rushing to the hospital because," Rebecca began to explain, her voice clear and respectful. Judge Richardson looked up from her papers with tired eyes. She had heard this beginning so many times before. Hospital emergencies, sick relatives, work crises, family problems. Everyone who stood before her bench seemed to have a special reason for breaking the law. "Ma'am, I've heard every excuse today," Judge Richardson interrupted with a sharp tone that cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Everyone thinks they have a special reason for breaking the law. The speed limit is there for everyone's safety, not just when it's convenient for you." Rebecca's mouth closed, but she didn't step back. She stood straight and tried again. Her voice a little quieter now, but still steady. "But my elderly father had fallen, and the hospital called to say." "That's enough," the judge said firmly, raising her hand to stop Rebecca from continuing. "I don't want to hear another word. I'm imposing the maximum fine of £300 plus court costs. You need to take responsibility for your actions instead of making excuses." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the people in the back row stopped their quiet conversations. The only sound was the old heating system humming in the walls, and the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. Rebecca's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of the judge's words had physically pushed down on her. But she maintained her composure, keeping her head high and her back straight. She didn't argue or raise her voice. She didn't show anger or frustration. Though both emotions flickered briefly in her eyes, she simply nodded once and said quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca walked slowly to the clerk's desk at the side of the courtroom. Her heels clicked softly against the old wooden floor. The clerk, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, looked at Rebecca with sympathy as she processed the payment. Rebecca opened her purse, pulled out her checkbook, and wrote a check for £150 total. The people in the courtroom watched this scene with growing discomfort. An elderly man in the front row shook his head slightly. A young mother holding a baby shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases over the years, seemed to sense that something wasn't right about this interaction. As Rebecca finished paying her fine, she folded the receipt carefully and placed it in her purse. She turned back toward the courtroom, and walked up the center aisle toward the exit. Her steps were measured and dignified. Even though everyone could see the disappointment in her face, many people in the courtroom followed her with their eyes, watching her leave with a mixture of sympathy and respect. Some whispered quietly to each other about how unfairly she had been treated. Others simply felt sad about what they had witnessed. Judge Richardson had already moved on to the next case. Before Rebecca even reached the door, she called out another name from her list. Ready to continue with her busy schedule, the next defendant, a young white man with a similar speeding ticket, stepped forward nervously. Emma was completely unaware that this moment would soon change her life forever. She had no idea that the woman she had just dismissed so harshly would return to her courtroom under very different circumstances. She continued with her day, processing case after case, never imagining that her treatment of Rebecca Thompson would come back to teach her the most important lesson of her career. Sometimes the people we judge the quickest are the ones who can teach us the most about ourselves. 3 days later, Judge Emma Richardson arrived at her office with her usual morning routine. She hung her coat on the wooden rack behind her door, placed her leather briefcase on the desk, and started her coffee machine. The familiar sounds of the courthouse beginning its daily operations filled the hallway outside. Her office. Margaret, her assistant for the past 8 years, knocked on the door and entered with a stack of mail. Margaret was a cheerful woman in her 50s who always wore bright sweaters and kept fresh flowers on her desk. She had worked at the courthouse longer than most people and knew every judge, clerk, and bailiff by name. "Good morning, Judge Richardson," Margaret said, placing the mail on the desk. "You have a busy schedule today, but there's one letter that came by special delivery. It looks important." Emma picked up her coffee mug and took a sip while sorting through the mail. Bills, court notifications, and legal updates made up most of the pile. But one envelope stood out. It was thick, official-looking, and bore the seal of the State Judicial Review Board. She opened it carefully and began to read. The words seemed to blur together at first, but then their meaning became crystal clear. The State Judicial Review Board was launching an investigation into her courtroom practices. The letter explained they were looking into possible bias in sentencing patterns based on a complaint that had been filed. Emma's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. The hot liquid suddenly tasted bitter and cold. She read the letter again, more slowly this time, hoping she had misunderstood something. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to Margaret, who was organizing files on the shelf. "I treat everyone the same way. I've been fair and professional for 15 years. Margaret looked up with concern. "What's wrong? Judge Richardson, you look upset." Emma waved the letter in the air. "They're investigating me for bias. Me. Can you believe it? I follow the law exactly as it's written. I don't care if someone is rich or poor, young or old, black or white. The law is the law." The letter stated that a lead investigator would be reviewing her case files, interviewing court staff, and observing her courtroom sessions over the next several weeks. The investigation would be thorough and comprehensive. Judge Richardson felt her heart rate increase as she read the details. Margaret sat down in the chair across from the desk. "I'm sure it's just routine, Judge. You're one of the fairest judges I've ever worked with. Everyone knows that." But Emma felt defensive and angry. She had worked hard to build her reputation as a no-nonsense judge who didn't play favorites. She prided herself on being tough but fair, consistent in her decisions, and respectful of the law above all else. The idea that someone would question her integrity felt like a personal attack. She spent the rest of the morning distracted during court proceedings, between cases. She kept thinking about the letter and wondering who could have complained about She tried to remember any recent cases that might have caused controversy, but nothing came to mind. During her lunch break, she called her husband David from her office. David worked as an accountant at a small firm downtown. They had been married for 12 years. He was a calm, steady man who always helped her see things clearly when she felt overwhelmed. "They're investigating me for a bias," she said, pacing round her office with the phone pressed to her ear. "Can you believe it? I follow the law exactly as it's written. I don't show favoritism to anyone." David listened quietly on the other end of the line. She could hear the sounds of his office in the background, keyboards clicking and phones ringing. When she finished explaining the situation, he took a moment before responding. "Maybe it's just routine, Emma," he said in his gentle voice. "I'm sure everything will be fine. You're the most honest person I know. You've always been fair in everything you do." But Judge Richardson couldn't shake her worry. The investigation felt like a dark cloud hanging over her head. She had built her entire career on being respected and trusted. The thought that someone questioned her fairness made her feel sick to her stomach. That evening, she went home to their small house on Oak Street and tried to eat dinner. But the food tasted like cardboard. David made her favorite meal, chicken and rice with vegetables. But she could barely finish half of it after dinner. She went to her home office and pulled out files from recent cases. She spread them across her desk and began reviewing each one carefully. She was convinced she would find nothing wrong. Every decision seemed justified to her. Every fine and sentence appeared appropriate based on the law and the circumstances. She stayed up until nearly midnight, going through case after case, the defendants' names and faces blurred together in her memory. Traffic violations, petty theft, public disturbance, unpaid fines. She had handled hundreds of cases just like these over the years. As she finally turned off the light and went to bed, Emma felt confident that the investigation would clear her name. She had no idea that her life was about to intersect with someone she had already met. She had no idea that the woman she had dismissed so harshly just 3 days earlier would soon return to her courtroom under very different circumstances. Sometimes the truth about ourselves is the hardest thing to see, even when it's right in front of us. Monday morning arrived with autumn rain tapping steadily against the tall courthouse windows. The sound created a gentle rhythm that normally helped Judge Emma Richardson feel calm and focused. But today was different. Today she would meet the investigator who would be evaluating her work, her decisions, and her entire career. Emma stood in front of the mirror in her office, straightening her black judicial robes with nervous fingers. She had worn these robes thousands of times before, but today they felt heavier somehow. The weight of the upcoming investigation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She walked to her desk and picked up her coffee mug, taking a small sip of the warm liquid. The coffee tasted bitter this morning. Or maybe it was just her imagination. Everything seemed different when you knew someone was watching, judging, and evaluating your every move. Margaret had already arranged her schedule to allow for the meeting with the investigator. The morning court session would be delayed by an hour to give them time to talk. Emma had spent the weekend preparing for this moment, thinking about what questions she might be asked and how she would defend her record. At exactly 9 o'clock, a knock came at her office door. The sound was firm but polite, neither too loud nor too soft. Emma took a deep breath and called out, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Emma's world seemed to tilt sideways as she recognized the woman standing in her doorway. It was the same woman who had stood before her bench just days ago. The woman in the blue dress who had tried to explain about her elderly father. Rebecca Thompson stepped into the office with quiet confidence. She carried a professional black briefcase, and wore a dark grey suit that looked expensive and well-tailored. Round her neck hung a name badge that read Dr. Rebecca Thompson, State Judicial Review Board in clear. Official lettering. Judge Richardson's face went pale as if all the blood had drained from her cheeks. Her coffee mug trembled slightly in her hand, and she quickly set it down on the desk before she could drop it. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt a strange ringing in her ears. "Good morning, Your Honor," Rebecca said with calm professionalism. Her voice was steady and controlled, showing no sign of anger or resentment. "I'm Dr. Thompson, the lead investigator assigned to your case. I have a doctorate in criminal justice and specialize in judicial bias analysis," Emma stared at Rebecca, unable to process what she was seeing. This was impossible. The woman she had dismissed interrupted. And Find was now standing in her office wearing an official badge and carrying the authority to investigate her entire career. The judge struggled to find words. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Her mind raced through the events of last Tuesday, remembering how harshly she had treated this woman, how she had refused to listen to her explanation, how she had imposed the maximum fine without hesitation. I remember you," Judge Richardson managed to say finally. Her voice sounded weak and uncertain, nothing like the confident tone she used in the courtroom. Rebecca nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I was in your courtroom last Tuesday regarding a traffic violation." Her voice remained steady and professional, showing no emotion or personal feelings. "I want to assure you that my personal experience will not affect my investigation. I will be reviewing data, case files, and statistical patterns objectively." Emma felt the room spinning round her. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. The woman she had treated with such little respect, the woman whose explanation she had refused to hear, was now in a position to evaluate her entire career. The woman she had judged so quickly and harshly was now the one who would judge her. Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder filled with papers and documents. "I've already begun reviewing your case files from the past 2 years," she continued in the same professional tone. "I'll be conducting interviews with court staff, observing your courtroom sessions, and analyzing sentencing patterns." Judge Richardson watched Rebecca's hands as she organized the papers on the desk. These were the same hands that had written a check for the fine just days ago, the same hands that had folded the receipt and placed it carefully in her purse. "Dr. Thompson," Emma said slowly, testing the title. "I had no idea you were. I didn't know you worked for the review board." Rebecca looked up from her papers and met Emma's eyes directly. "There was no reason you would know, Your Honor. I was simply another defendant in your courtroom that day. But I want to be clear that my role as investigator will be completely separate from my experience as a defendant." Emma nodded, but her mind was still reeling. She remembered how she had cut Rebecca off mid-sentence, how she had said she didn't want to hear another word. Now this same woman would be listening to everything, reviewing everything, judging everything. The rain continued to tap against the windows, creating a soundtrack for this real moment. Emma realized that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The woman she had dismissed was now the one who held her future in her hands. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. 2 weeks later, Dr. Thompson requested a meeting to discuss her preliminary findings. The message came through Margaret, who delivered it with a worried expression on her face. Judge Richardson had been dreading this moment ever since the investigation began, but she knew it was unavoidable. She sat in her office that Friday afternoon, waiting for Dr. Thompson to arrive. The autumn sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across her desk. Emma had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with possibilities about what the investigation might have uncovered, when Dr. Thompson knocked on the door. Emma's stomach tightened into knots. She called out for her to come in, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. Dr. Thompson entered carrying a large briefcase and full manila folders thick with documents. Judge Richardson sat across from her at the small conference table in the corner of her office. She felt nervous and defensive, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mouth was dry, and she kept swallowing hard, trying to calm her racing heart. "I've analyzed your sentencing patterns from the past 2 years," Dr. Thompson began. Her voice calm and matter-of-fact. She opened her briefcase and began spreading charts and graphs across the table. The papers were filled with numbers, statistics, and colored lines that meant nothing to Emma at first glance. "The data reveals some concerning trends," Dr. Thompson continued, ranging the documents in a neat row. Each chart was labeled with dates and case numbers that Emma recognized from her own courtroom. Dr. Thompson pointed to a graph showing fine amounts with her pen. The chart had different colored bars representing different groups of people. Black and minority defendants receive fines that are, on average, 40% higher than white defendants for similar violations. She explained. "The difference is consistent across all types of cases." Emma stared at the graph, her eyes moving back and forth between the tall bars and the short ones. The numbers seemed impossible to believe. 40% higher. That couldn't be right. Dr. Thompson picked up another chart, this one showing interruption patterns during court proceedings. "You also interrupt defendants of color 60% more often than white defendants," she said, pointing to the data. "The average black defendant is interrupted 3.2 times during their statement, while the average white defendant is interrupted 1.3 times. Judge Richardson felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The heat rose up her neck and spread across her face like fire. "That can't be right," she said, her voice getting louder. "I don't see color in my courtroom. I treat everyone exactly the same way." "I understand you believe that," Dr. Thompson said gently, her tone remaining calm and professional. "But unconscious bias affects everyone, even well-intentioned people. It's not about being a bad person or having bad intentions. It's about patterns we don't even realize we're following." Dr. Thompson reached into her folder and pulled out a specific case file. She opened it carefully and placed it in front of Judge Richardson. "Look at this case from last month," she said. Emma recognized the file immediately. It was the case of Mr. William Stevens, a white businessman who had been caught speeding on the same street where Rebecca had been ticketed. The details were all there in black and white. His excuse was that he was late for a golf meeting. Dr. Thompson noted, reading from the file, "You accepted his explanation and reduced his fine to 0. He received a warning instead of a penalty." Emma stared at the file, remembering the case clearly now. Mr. Stevens had been wearing an expensive suit and had spoken with confidence about his important business meeting. She had found his explanation reasonable and had decided to give him a break. "But my elderly father had fallen and I was rushing to the hospital," Dr. Thompson said quietly, repeating the words she had tried to say in the courtroom that day. "That was my excuse. Yet you imposed the maximum fine of £300. Judge Richardson felt the room spinning round her. The comparison was devastating. A golf meeting versus a medical emergency. A warning versus the maximum fine. The same violation, the same street, but completely different outcomes. Dr. Thompson pulled out more files, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. Case after case showed the same pattern. White defendants received lighter sentences, more warnings, more second chances. Black and minority defendants received harsher treatment, higher fines, less patience. Emma saw her own signature on dozens of cases that showed the same troubling pattern. The data was undeniable, spread out before her like a mirror reflecting her own unconscious actions. Each signature was proof of decisions she had made, decisions she had thought were fair and just. She picked up one file after another, reading the details of cases she barely remembered. Each one told the same story of unequal treatment, of unconscious bias affecting her judgment without her realizing it. The evidence was overwhelming. The numbers didn't lie. The patterns were clear and consistent. Her world began to shake as she realized the truth about her own behavior. Judge Richardson stared at the mountain of evidence before her, and for the first time in years, she began to cry. The tears started slowly, just a few drops rolling down her cheeks. Then they came faster, until she was sobbing quietly into her hands. The hardest truths are often the ones that set us free. Judge Richardson didn't sleep for 3 nights after seeing the evidence. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every case, every decision, every interaction from the past years. The charts and graphs that Dr. Thompson had shown her were burned into her memory like painful photographs she couldn't forget. Each night, she got up and went to her home office. Turning on the small desk lamp and pulling out more case files, she studied them with new eyes, looking for the patterns that had been invisible to her before. The evidence was everywhere. Once she knew how to see it. David found her there on Wednesday morning, asleep at a desk with files scattered round her. He gently shook her shoulder and helped her to bed. But she was back at the desk within hours. The pattern was clear, and it broke her heart completely. She saw herself in a new light. And it was painful. The judge she thought she was under, judge she actually was, were two completely different people. The realization felt like losing a part of herself. But she knew it was necessary. On Friday morning, she sat in her office staring at the phone for nearly an hour before finally picking it up. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed Dr. Thompson's number. When Dr. Thompson answered, Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to see you," she said quietly. "Can we meet today?" Dr. Thompson agreed to come to the courthouse that afternoon. Emma spent the morning cancelling her court sessions and asking Margaret to clear her schedule. She needed this conversation more than she needed anything else. They met in the same office where the investigation had begun just 3 weeks earlier. The autumn light streaming through the windows looked different now, softer somehow. Judge Richardson sat at her desk, but this time she looked completely different from the confident, defensive woman who had first met Dr. Thompson. Emma looked humbled, open, and ready to listen. Her usual stern expression had been replaced by something vulnerable and genuine. She had been crying again, and her eyes were red and tired. "You're right," she said simply, without any of the defensiveness she had shown before. "I've been blind to my own actions. I thought I was being fair, but I was causing real harm to people who deserved better." Dr. Thompson sat across from her, her expression gentle and understanding. She had seen judges react to this kind of evidence before, but Emma's response was different. There was no anger, no denial, no attempts to justify her actions, just honest recognition of the truth. "I'm sorry," Emma continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry for how I treated you in my courtroom. I'm sorry for not listening to you about your father. I'm sorry for all the people I've hurt without even knowing it." Dr. Thompson smiled softly, the first truly warm expression Emma had seen from her. "Recognizing the problem is the first step toward fixing it," she said. "Most people never get to this point. The fact that you can see it now means you can change it." Judge Richardson looked up with hope in her eyes for the first time in days. "Will you help me?" she asked. "I want to do better. I want to be there." "Judge, I always thought I was." "Of course," Dr. Thompson replied without hesitation. "That's what I'm here for. over the following months. They worked together like partners rather than investigator and subject. Judge Richardson attended bias training sessions at the state capitol, learning about unconscious prejudice and how it affected decision-making. She read books about racial justice and listened to stories from people who had been affected by biased court decisions. She implemented new courtroom procedures designed to ensure fairness. She created a checklist to review before making sentencing decisions. She started timing her interactions with defendants to make sure everyone received equal attention and respect. Most importantly, she began mentoring other judges throughout the state. She shared her story honestly, admitting her mistakes and showing how recognition and change were possible. She started each day by reminding herself to truly listen to every person who appeared before her, regardless of their background or appearance. The transformation was gradual but profound. Court staff noticed the change first. Margaret commented that Judge Richardson seemed more patient and thoughtful. The bailiff observed that she asked more questions and listened more carefully to answers. 6 months later, Judge Richardson stood before the community at the annual courthouse open house. The large auditorium was packed with lawyers, court staff, and community members. Dr. Thompson watched from the audience, proud of the transformation she had witnessed. Justice isn't about being perfect, Judge Richardson told the crowd, her voice strong and clear. It's about being willing to grow, to learn, and to do better tomorrow than we did today. I made mistakes that hurt people, and I'm committed to making sure those mistakes never happen again. The audience applauded. But Emma wasn't finished. She talked about unconscious bias, about the importance of listening, and about the responsibility that came with wearing judicial robes. She encouraged everyone to examine their own actions and beliefs. After the speech, the two women met near the back of the auditorium. They shook hands, but it felt more like a greeting between old friends. Their formal conclusion to an investigation. "Thank you," Emma said simply. "Thank you for being willing to change," Dr. Thompson replied. What had started as an investigation had become a friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Change is possible when we have the courage to look in the mirror and the wisdom to ask for help. The end.